Last lecture, we were concerned with the rationality of faith. And while faith in the reliability of careful reasoning is rational, and we might have the right to take a position on certain ethical matters if we're not risking harm to others, faith on existential matters like God's existence is not rational. Without evidence, disbelief is more rational. But that wouldn't matter if God's existence didn't require faith, if it could be proven. And that brings us to the big question of this section. Does God exist? The most popular way of trying to prove God exists is by trying to show that God's existence is the best explanation for the universe, which brings us to the question of this lecture. Why is there something rather than nothing? And our attempt to answer this question will actually be tackling two related questions. For one, why is the universe as it is? Why does it have the properties it has? Arguments that suggest God is the best explanation for the universe's design are called teleological arguments. Telos being Greek for end or goal or purpose, as in the universe was created for a purpose. We'll consider the most convincing such argument of this kind shortly. But first, we will discuss the best cosmological argument, cosmos being Greek for world, or as we would say today, universe. Such arguments suggest that God is the best explanation for the existence of the universe. And in my experience, philosophers agreed that the best version of such arguments is called the Kalam cosmological argument. It gets its name from those who developed it, medieval Muslim theologians who formed various schools of thought, the Ilm al-Kalam, the science of discourse used to defend Islam. They thought that the arguments for God of the Falasifa, a competing sect of Muslim theologians inspired by Greek philosophy, Falsafa, were faulty. The Falsafa's arguments suggested that all material things depended on the existence of a necessary entity, an entity that must exist. Kalam theologians, however, like Al-Ghazali in the 11th century, rightly pointed out that even if there must be a necessary entity, the Falsafa argument gives no reason for why that entity couldn't simply be the universe itself. Similar worries would arise later regarding the arguments of the Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas, who was also influenced by Greek thought, namely the work of Aristotle. In the 13th century, he suggested that all chains of causation had to terminate in an uncaused causer, and that the uncaused causer was God. But why couldn't that uncaused causer simply be the universe itself? After all, if we think back to our criteria of adequacy, which explanation is simpler? The universe exists and is uncaused, or the universe exists but needs a cause, and that cause is God and he's uncaused? Clearly, the former. The latter has an extra, infinite entity. Similar problems arise for versions of the argument rooted in the principle of sufficient reason, the notion that everything has an explanation. Such arguments suggest that God is the self-explained explainer. But again, why can't the one thing that doesn't need to be explained be the universe itself instead of God? What is needed, it seems, is a good reason for why rules like the principle of sufficient reason apply to the universe, but not to God. A reason for why God can be a necessary entity, an uncaused caused, or a self-explained explainer, but the universe cannot. We have to be careful here. We can't merely stipulate that God is an exception to such a rule. That's just special pleading, the logical fallacy of invoking a special case to save an argument. It's like saying that a football team is undefeated, and then when you realize that they've actually lost a game, you just say, well, that game didn't count. So you can't just say, for example, that the principle everything needs an explanation just doesn't apply to God. You need a good reason for why that rule doesn't apply to him. We need to find something that sets God apart from the universe so that it needs an explanation while God does not. But that is exactly what the Kalam cosmological argument tries to provide. Modern versions of the Kalam argument, given by the likes of Christian apologists like William Lane Craig, go something like this. 1. Things that begin to exist need an explanation. For example, think about all the objects around you right now. They began to exist, and their existence has an explanation. 2. But something that did not begin to exist would not have and does not need an explanation. If it's always been, then it's always been. 3. The universe began to exist, but God did not. Thus, 4. The universe needs an explanation, but God does not. And since God can explain the universe without needing an explanation himself, God is the best explanation for the universe, and thus God exists. So, according to the argument, we're not just stipulating that God is an exception to the rule. There is a reason he's an exception. God didn't begin to exist, but the universe did. Initially, it seems this argument is valid and its premises are true. Originally, the most controversial premise was the universe has a beginning. The Kalam scholars tried to prove it with a clever argument regarding untraversable infinities. But given modern Big Bang cosmology, which shows the universe began with a singularity igniting in a giant explosion about 13.8 billion years ago, we don't need any of that. We can grant that formerly controversial premise without argument. Nevertheless, appearances can be deceiving. And in reality, the argument is fraught with many problems. Let's begin with the most complicated problem first. To bolster its first premise, the argument uses the example of everyday objects that clearly began to exist. But everyday objects are very different from the universe, especially in the way that they come into existence. For example, let's suppose that you know that there are X number of objects in the universe. Then you and your son construct a Lego model of the Death Star from Star Wars. Put all the pieces together, then you have a Death Star. Question: how many objects are there in the universe now? There were X. Is it now X plus 1 because you just created a new object, a Lego Death Star? Perhaps, but notice that you did not create any new matter. The amount of matter in the universe remained constant. You just rearranged it. In fact, the matter that makes up your Lego Death Star has existed since the beginning of the universe. The people at Lego just arranged that matter into individual pieces, and then you arrange those pieces according to their instructions. That's how this new object came into existence. But same is true for all of the ordinary, everyday objects around you. When you explain the existence of such an object, you are just explaining how the matter that makes up that object came to be arranged in the way that it is. So if the first premise of the argument is going to be true, if everyday objects are going to serve as its evidence, that first premise must merely observe that the arrangement of matter that makes up objects has an explanation. But unfortunately, that tells us nothing about how the matter that makes up those objects came into existence, or whether or not the existence of that matter itself needs an explanation. And so that premise tells us nothing about whether or not the existence of the universe needs an explanation. Explaining the existence of the universe is not explaining how its matter came to be arranged. It's explaining how its matter came into existence in the first place. For the argument to be valid and to not equivocate on the word existence, we'd have to change the first premise to the matter that makes up objects needs an explanation. If that's true, then the universe does need an explanation. But of course, the universe is the matter that makes up objects. That means the argument, by changing that first premise, now just begs the question. It argues in a circle. To think that the argument is sound, one would already have to assume that its conclusion is true. It concludes that the existence of matter needs an explanation because the existence of matter needs an explanation. Now, that actually should be enough to set the argument aside. It's circular, doesn't work. But there are still other problems with the argument that deserve a mention. For example, it asserts that everything that begins to exist has a cause. But in fact, matter can come into existence without a cause. This has been measured and well documented by scientists studying quantum physics. In a vacuum, subatomic particle-antiparticle pairs occasionally come into existence spontaneously without a cause. We might say this violates the old cliche, something can't come from nothing, but instead, some scientists have suggested that vacuums are not really nothing. They contain no matter, but they do contain virtual particles, a kind of quantum foam or probability field that can collapse into physical particles. This foam exists everywhere, even where matter does not, and would even exist in the absence of a universe. Physicist Ed Tryon has even argued that our universe could just be a large version of such a fluctuation. Our observations of our universe suggest that it has the properties that such a fluctuation would have. It has zero net energy. If so, then our universe is, quote, simply one of those things which happen from time to time, end quote. As is wont to happen, a vacuum fluctuation created a singularity, a single point containing a large amount of matter, which then exploded, generating the universe. So the universe itself could be an example of something that violates the Coulomb's things that have a beginning have a cause law. But even if we don't deny this law, the Coulomb argument is still in trouble because the quantum foam is eternal. It never began to exist. It always has and always will be. Thus, the foam, by the lights of the Coulomb argument, would not need an explanation. Now, we might wonder, well, what's the better explanation for the singularity, the quantum foam or God? But since the quantum foam is fairly well understood, and God is an unexplained entity with inexplicable powers, the God hypothesis does not fare well against the quantum foam as an explanation. What's more, even if you don't like all of this quantum foam talk, the singularity itself may not even need an explanation. Since its explosion marks the beginning of time, nothing can come before it, and thus nothing can cause it. Causes precede their effects. In fact, it might even be wrong to say that it began to exist. And even if it did begin to exist, the singularity is as small as anything can be and exists for no time and is governed by no laws. If anything is a candidate for something that need not be explained, it would seem to be the singularity. Wouldn't anything you introduce to explain the singularity be more complex than the singularity? Certainly God is, since he has a wide array of infinite properties. The only thing that would seem to be simpler than the singularity would be something equivalent to nothingness itself, like the quantum foam. So the best answer to our question, why is there something rather than nothing, may simply be this. There just is. The existence of the universe may simply be a brute fact, something that just is true. Now, even if the existence of the universe is a brute fact, its properties may not be. After all, if the arrangement of the matter of ordinary objects needs an explanation, then maybe the matter that makes up the universe needs an explanation for its arrangement too. In short, perhaps the universe exhibits design indicative of a designer. This brings us to the teleological argument, the argument from design. Earlier versions of such arguments have fallen short because of modern knowledge. The apparent design of the human body has been explained via evolution and natural selection. The existence of a planet like ours, seemingly designed for the evolution of life, is explained by the size of our universe and the number of planets in it. So today, those like the modern physicist Paul Davies and the modern philosopher Robin Collins argue that it is the universe itself that seems to be designed, fine-tuned for evolution or for the evolution of life within it. After all, there's only one universe, right? but there's a seemingly infinite number of ways that it could have turned out. Specifically, there are a seemingly infinite number of laws that could have governed it. Take, for example, the mass of neutrinos, tiny particles that travel near the speed of light and are so small they can pass right through solid objects. Advocates of the fine-tuning argument rightly observe that their mass is a mere 5 times 10 to the negative 35th kilogram. That's a decimal, 34 zeros, and then a 5. But, they point out, if their mass had been 5 times 10 to the negative 34th or the negative 36th kilogram, then life could not have evolved. In other words, if there had been one less zero between the decimal and the 5, the neutrinos would be so massive and create so much gravity that they would cause the universe to collapse. If there were one more zero, neutrinos would be so light that the universe would have expanded too quickly to form galaxies and life could not evolve. Either way, life could not have evolved. Aren't we lucky that there are exactly 34 zeros? Actually, advocates of the fine-tuning argument suggest that it can't just be a matter of luck. After all, this is just one example of a law or constant that governs the universe. Yet there is an infinite number of values that each constant or law could have had. If any one of them were just slightly different, then life could not have evolved. The odds of them all just happening to have all the right values is just too low. The better explanation is that the universe had a designer who fine-tuned it for life. This argument seems impressive, but it actually suffers from a number of fatal flaws. Now, I covered this argument in more detail in another of my courses called Exploring Metaphysics, but let's just look at its philosophical problems. First, the argument exaggerates the universe's fine-tuning by exploiting misleading units of measurement to make fine-tuning seem much more unlikely than it is. Recall that it expressed the mass of neutrinos as 5 times 10 to the negative 35th kilogram, and said that if there was just one more or one less zero in this number, life could not have evolved. Now that seems remarkable, but the kilogram is a unit of measurement used to express the weight of medium-sized objects like persons. But neutrinos are super tiny, so just about any fluctuation in their mass expressed in kilograms is going to be significant. But that doesn't mean that their mass is fine-tuned. To explain why, let me modify an example from philosopher Neil A. Manson. If we express Michael Jordan's height in light years, a unit of measurement that expresses how far light travels in a year, Jordan would be 2 times 10 to the negative 16th of a light year tall. If he were 2 times 10 to the negative 17th, he'd be far too short to play basketball, a mere 18 centimeters tall. And if he were 2 times 10 to the negative 15th, he would be far too tall, a lumbering giant at 59 feet. But this doesn't mean that Jordan's height is fine-tuned for playing basketball. In reality, his height could be a full 6 inches different in both directions, a range of 14% of his actual height, and he'd still be one of the best basketball players of all time. He could even be a full foot taller or shorter, and he'd still be pretty good. Likewise, the neutrino could actually be much lighter or heavier than it is by about 10 times, and it would not affect the expansion of the universe in any great degree. Certainly not enough of a degree to make the evolution of life impossible. When expressed like that, the mass of the neutrino doesn't seem fine-tuned at all. It's only because the argument expresses its mass in kilograms that it seemed so remarkable. And something similar could be said about each of the values that advocates of the fine-tuning argument mention. But the Jordan example brings up another important point. Any number could, theoretically, represent how tall Jordan is. He could be 1 foot, 2 foot, 100 feet, or 1,000,000 feet tall. But we don't really think that every one of those values is equally likely. The most likely values cluster around a certain point. For the American male, it's around 5 foot 10 inches. and other values get less likely the further we move out. There is no real chance that Jordan could have been 10 times taller than he actually is. Well, the same is true of the values that the fine-tuning argument points to. For example, every possible mass of the neutrino is not equally likely. They definitely couldn't have been the size of bowling balls. They probably couldn't have even been 10 times heavier than they are. The values that are likely cluster around a certain range. But unless the person presenting the fine-tuning argument can define what that range is, and then show that only a fraction of the values in that range are conducive to the universe supporting life, the argument won't be successful. And needless to say, no one has actually ever successfully met this burden. Now, I suppose we could say that without a frame of reference, every value that we could assign to the laws and constants of our universe is equally likely. So it really is the case that the mass of the neutrino could be anything, from a fraction of a kilogram to the size of a bowling ball to any of the infinite number of values in between and beyond. If so, it would seem that the chances that their values fall within the range necessary for life is unimaginably low. We could even put a number on it. The chances are 1 in infinity. In fact, this is what the fine-tuning argument suggests. But the problem now is 1 in infinity is a meaningless fraction. In order for statements of odds to be meaningful, they have to be expressed in finite numbers. To see why, suppose I told you that the neutrino had to have exactly the mass that it has for life to evolve. What are the chances that it would have the right value? Well, since we're assuming that it could have any value, there are an infinite number of values outside that range. The chances are 1 in infinity. But suppose I told you their mass could be 1 billion times smaller than it is, or 1 billion times larger. Let's say they could be as massive as a bowling ball, or even as massive as our sun, and life could still evolve. What would the chances be then? Well, it'd be exactly the same. It would be 1 in infinity, since there are an infinite number of values outside of that range. Clearly, the expression 1 in infinity tells us nothing about how likely something actually is. So, fine-tuning argument is in deep trouble here. But it gets even worse. The argument is also logically fallacious. Its conclusion does not follow from its premises. It concludes that the universe must be fine-tuned based on the observation that if one of its properties were any different, then it could no longer support life. It has to have exactly the properties it has. But this simply does not follow. Even if it were true that if any of one of the laws were different, the universe could no longer support life if any of the one laws were different, it does not follow that the laws we have are the only ones conducive to life. Let me explain by example. Suppose you come across a square with sides exactly 1 foot in length. You might rightly observe that if any of the sides of that square were a different length than they are, say by being shorter, then it would no longer be a square. This is true. It does not follow from this fact, however, that the only way to make a square is with sides that are 1 foot in length. As long as all 4 sides are equal in length, then you have a square. In other words, even though a minor change in a square makes it no longer a square, there's more than one way to make a square. Similarly, even though a minor change in our universe's laws might make it non-conducive to life, that doesn't mean that our universe represents the only way to have a universe that's conducive to life. There may be more than one way. And indeed there is. Physicist Victor Stenger has shown that if you allow for changes in all the governing factors and allow them to be set randomly, you get a universe conducive to life about 50% of the time. There is more than one way to set the dials to get a universe conducive to life. What's more, many of those supposedly fine-tuned values that are actually intrinsically linked. You can't set them randomly. Changing one necessarily and automatically changes the others and keeps them in balance such that galaxy stars and life are possible. Now, some might suggest that this needs an explanation, the fact that they're intrinsically linked like this, but it's actually just a result of conservation. The fact that the total amount of measurable properties in a closed system always remains constant. For example, the conservation of energy necessitates that the universe's expansion rate and its mass density are what they are. They literally can't be different than they are. The mass of neutrinos is also dictated by their number. Otherwise, conservation is violated. If there were more neutrinos, then they would all be lighter, and if there were fewer neutrinos, they would all be heavier. It will always balance out. And since conservation is an intrinsic property of space-time itself, it doesn't require any further explanation. It's kind of as if the universe is intrinsically one of those Hoberman expanding spheres. All the sides are linked so that if you pull one, they all move to the same degree. No matter how you adjust it, it's always a sphere. Likewise, no matter how you adjust the universe's constants, it will always support life. So it's not fine-tuned at all. So, as answers to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And as arguments for God's existence, it seems that both the cosmological and the teleological arguments fail. But perhaps this shouldn't have been surprising. As the modern philosopher Theodor Schick points out in his article, Can God Explain Anything? As an explanation of any natural phenomenon, God did it will always fall short. It will never be the best explanation because it will always be less simple, less conservative, and less wide-scoping than its competitors. It will invoke extra entities, it will violate physical laws, and essentially boil down to trying to explain the unexplained with the inexplicable. But Schick is actually just echoing something that the ancient philosopher Plato suggested long ago, that to explain something by appealing to the gods is simply an attempt to evade admitting that you actually have no explanation at all. As he puts it in the Cratylus, in the tragic poets, when stuck in a dilemma, quote, have recourse to the introduction of gods on machines, end quote. When the poets had painted the characters in their dramas into a corner and had no other way out, they would simply bring in an actor playing a god, literally by a machine like a crane, and that god would just resolve the conflict and end the play. This is where we get the phrase deus ex machina in literary or drama studies. When there is no other way out of a plot problem, you can just invoke God or a twist of fate to fix it. So too, Plato says, we might be tempted to solve a philosophical problem by simply saying, oh, the gods did it. But this is just, quote, clever evasions on the part of those who refuse to offer any rational theory, end quote. In other words, doing so is just an excuse for admitting that we have no solution or explanation. And besides that, it's kind of dangerous. Invoking God to explain the unexplained can prevent us from discovering the real explanation. And if we only believe in God because he explains something currently unexplained, well, then we're going to be in a world of hurt when someone else finally explains it. But Plato brings us to an interesting point and maybe even gives us a ray of hope. Many object to the cosmological and teleological arguments by suggesting that they do not point specifically to God. Even if the universe needs a creator or designer, why must that creator or designer be God? Why couldn't it have been one of the Greek gods in one of those plays, like Zeus? Or for that matter, why couldn't it be interdimensional aliens? Indeed, in response to the 2014 movie Interstellar in my Psychology Today blog, I once explained why it's even logically consistent, given certain views of time, that humanity itself may be responsible for the universe's existence and its design. We may be the interdimensional aliens ourselves and only exist now because we will exist to ensure our own existence. And as I discussed in my Exploring Metaphysics course, it's even possible that our universe was designed by a computer programmer and that we are living in a computer simulation. But if any of these things are true, wouldn't we just call that thing God? If Zeus were the creator designer, wouldn't he be God? Or if our universe were created designed by interdimensional aliens, wouldn't they be God? If humanity created itself, wouldn't humanity be God? Indeed, We could push this even further. Suppose the existence of the universe is a brute fact. Might the universe itself be God? Indeed, some philosophers argue that God is just the mind that emerges from the complexity of the universe. Or perhaps the singularity is God, or maybe the quantum foam is God. But these possibilities turn us toward our next question. What exactly are we talking about when we talk about God? If God, by definition, has certain properties that the singularity doesn't have, then what properties exactly must God have if he really truly is to rightly be called God? In short, what exactly is God like?